During World War II, the Sherman tank garnered a reputation of being a death trap for its crew. It was commonly referred to as the Tommy Cooker by British crews, and labelled the Zippo by Americans. These nicknames, reinforced by battlefield rumours and post-war retellings, solidified the image of the Sherman as a highly combustible and dangerous tank to serve in, an image that would outlive the war itself. But was this reputation deserved? To understand this, we need to examine the context surrounding the Sherman's introduction. In 1942, the Sherman's design was finalised in 1941, intended to directly counter the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. At the time, the German Panther and Tiger tanks did not yet exist, and were therefore not considered during the Sherman's development. Early Shermans featured 51mm of sloped frontal armour, which on paper compared favourably to both Panzer IV and even the T-34s. Combined with superior reliability and guaranteed access to spare parts, the Sherman was, statistically, one of the most dependable tanks on the battlefield. Between 1942 and 45, over 49,000 Shermans were mass-produced, using American automotive mass production techniques. At peak output, one Sherman rolled off the assembly line every 90 minutes, a scale of production that Nazi Germany simply couldn't hope to match. The Sherman's 75mm gun proved extremely effective against infantry and fortifications. Its high explosive round was particularly valued by infantry units, making the Sherman an indispensable support weapon during advances. US Army doctrine in 1942 reflected this role, with medium tanks like the Sherman intended for infantry support and exploitation, while specialized tank destroyers such as the M10 were tasked with engaging enemy armor. However, during the invasion of mainland Europe, Shermans were forced into direct combat with German medium tanks, and even German heavy tanks later on in the war. Penetration alone did not automatically result in crew casualties. US Ballistic Research Laboratory studies showed that post-penetration effects, specifically internal fires and ammunition ignition, were the primary killers. In other words, it was not the shell entering the tank that doomed the crew, but what happened afterwards. This is where early Shermans suffered a critical flaw. Ammunition was stored inside sponsons along the hull walls. If the tank was penetrated, the ammunition was extremely likely to detonate, and there was a 60 to 80% chance of a catastrophic fire that would kill the entire crew due to the ammunition rack exploding. German intelligence identified this vulnerability by 1943. Tank crews and pack gun operators were trained to deliberately aim at the ammunition stowage areas. Ironically, attempts to armor these areas more heavily only made them stand out more to German gunners. The Sherman's weaknesses were amplified by its sheer numbers and visibility. As the most common Allied tank in Western Europe, if a tank was destroyed, it was usually a Sherman. Additionally, Allied forces had far more war correspondents than Germany or the Soviet Union, meaning Sherman losses were photographed and filmed more extensively. This created an availability bias, giving the impression that the Shermans burned more than other tanks. British crews first encountered the early Sherman in 1942 through the Lend-Lease Act, quickly coining the term Tommy Cooker. These experiences made it clear to the US Army Ordnance Department that a redesign was urgently needed, and that redesign arrived early in 1944 with the introduction of wet stowage ammunition. Ammunition was relocated from the side sponsons to the turret floor and surrounded by water glycol jackets. This innovation reduced the chance of ammunition detonation from 60 to 80% to just 10 to 15%, dramatically improving crew survivability. Live fire tests conducted by US Ordnance confirmed that penetrations were now far less likely to ignite ammunition or cause catastrophic internal fires. Introducing such a major change mid-production was extremely rare in wartime manufacturing, but it saved countless lives. Another key strength of the Sherman was its large turret and hull escape hatches. In a burning tank, seconds matter. The Sherman's design allowed for crews to abandon vehicles faster, often making the difference between survival and death. The Sherman also featured a fully rotating turret basket. This kept crew positions stable during turret rotation, reducing injuries and making emergency escape far easier. Fire suppression was also standard equipment. Shermans carried internal CO2 fire extinguishers, giving the crews a chance to control small fires before they turned fatal. Despite popular belief, tank-on-tank combat accounted for only a minority of Sherman losses, with German anti-tank guns, particularly the Pak-40, being responsible for most knockouts. The Sherman was never designed to duel enemy tanks. It was built to support infantry, a role it excelled in. Tiger tanks, while terrifying, were extremely rare. During Normandy, they accounted for less than 10% of all Allied tank losses. Their psychological impact was so exaggerated that Field Marshal Montgomery had to actively discourage inflated Tiger sightings among Allied crews. The Sherman was also the first tank of the war equipped with a vertical gun stabilizer. This allowed it to fire effectively whilst on the move, a significant advantage when advancing alongside infantry. In mid-1944, 76mm Shermans arrived in Europe, offering improved armor penetration. However, their high explosive rounds were less effective, leading many crews to prefer the older 75mm gun for infantry support. High-velocity armor-piercing ammunition further improved lethality, allowing Shermans to penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at close range. But this ammunition was extremely scarce and never widely available. Crews often added sandbags and spare tracks for perceived protection. However, official doctrine discouraged this, as testing showed that it was minimally effective, whilst placing significant strain on the suspension and drivetrain. The Jumbo Sherman represented the extreme end of survivability, with effective frontal armor exceeding 100mm. It was used as an assault tank. Ease of repair was another major advantage. A Sherman's engine could be replaced in 1 to 2 hours, compared to 8 to 12 hours for the Panzer IV, and tanks were often knocked out only to be back in action the next day, with a new crew. By the later stages of the war, Sherman crew survival rates reached 75 to 85%, comparable to heavily armoured tanks like the British Churchill. However, its reputation was already tarnished. Veterans frequently praised the Sherman for its escape hatches and internal layout, and armor thickness often mattered less than availability to escape, something the Sherman excelled at. The reality is that all tanks in the war were vulnerable. Mines, artillery, and anti-tank weapons destroyed tanks of all types. Once wet stowage was introduced, the Sherman became one of the most survivable and logistically effective tanks of the war, despite the reputation that continues to follow it. It was an excellent and survivable tank. However, unfortunately, its reputation was already tarnished.